Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal and I'm the host of the Living History program. In today's program, this will be part 2 of a 4-part series on China that we've decided to do called The Awakening of a Great Civilization. Again, I'm joined by our panelists, Arif, Ahmad and Yusuf Aftab. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
So, in the part 1 of the program, we covered from the Zia dynasty up to the Sui dynasty. So, just a little background to these programs. Everyone agrees that China's rise and transformation over the last few decades has been absolutely amazing. Napoleon had once remarked about China, "Let us sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world." It seems China has reawakened and it is making its presence being felt all around the world. When we look at the overall recorded history of the world, which goes back several thousand years, Asia has been the most important region of the world. For nearly 2,000 years until the mid-1800s, China and India were the biggest economies of the world. In many ways, the last 200 years of European dominance have been an aberration. Human civilizations and nations are like living organisms. They have life cycles. Some evolve into new nations and cultures, and some totally disappear from the face of the globe. China represents a large nation and a civilization which has gone through several cycles and has had many ups and downs. China is the only ancient civilization to fall down several times and rise again to enter the modern world. One of the most important distinguishing features of China is that it is a civilizational state, and unlike many other states in the world. So as I said, in part 1 of this 4-part series, we covered the period of the Xia dynasty, the earliest dynasty to rule China that's recorded in some of the ancient records, up to the Sui dynasty, going through obviously the important formation of a unified China through the Qin, Shi Hongdai, the emperor. And then, of course, the greatest ancient civilization, the Han dynasty, leading up to the Sui dynasty. So in part 2, which is today's program, we will cover the period from the Tang dynasty, which took over after the Sui dynasty, all the way up to the Yuan dynasty established by the Mongol Empire in 1279 CE. So Arif, if you could then just start us off with the great Tang dynasty, the period it ruled. And
Yes, of course. So the Tang dynasty ruled from 618 to 907 CE, and this was founded by the Emperor Gaozhou on 18th of June 618. And its rule lasted nearly 300 years, and the empire is regarded as the second golden age of Chinese civilization, and generally considered to be the most prosperous period of China. During its reign, Chang'an, which is modern Xi'an, the northern capital, became the largest city in the world, and Buddhism became the predominant religion for the common people. The Tang dynasty produced several of the most outstanding emperors in Chinese history. As an example, the personal name of Gao Chu was Li Yuan, and he was a prestigious aristocrat and first cousin of Emperor Yang of Sui, and one of the influential commanders in the Sui Empire. The massive wars and vast construction projects, which I think we mentioned in part 1 of these series.
yeah, those are the destructive wars with Korea in particular, yeah.
Absolutely. So those massive wars and construction projects led to many deaths and high taxes, and this made the Sui court very unpopular. So Li Yuan decided to bring the Sui dynasty to an end and rose in rebellion in 617 CE, along with his sons, an equally capable daughter, Princess Pingyang, who raised and commanded her own army of 70,000 troops. Having taken control of the capital, Chang'an, on June 618 CE, Li Yuan declared himself the emperor of a new dynasty, the Tang. Gaochou was an effective monarch who reformed the policies which had led to abuses under the Sui dynasty. He prudently maintained and improved upon the bureaucracy initiated by the Sui dynasty, while dispensing with extravagant military operations and building projects. With minor modifications, the bureaucratic policies of the Tang dynasty are still in use in the Chinese government in the modern day.
The Emperor Gaozu had a short reign of only 9 years. And the emperor that followed him was probably one of the greatest Chinese emperors, and his rise is really interesting. When the Emperor Gaozu died in a calculated and violent process for elimination of the royal bloodline due to, as usual, fear of assassination, Gaozu's son Li Shimin ambushed and killed 2 of his brothers, Crown Prince Li Yanqiong and Li Yuanji. And shortly thereafter, his father abdicated in his favor, and Li Shimin ascended the throne. He is conventionally known by his temple name as Emperor Taizong. As I say, one of the greatest emperors, and his rule was 626 to 649 CE. So, Yusuf, just take us through this great emperor and his achievements.
Yeah, so Emperor Taizong, as you've stated, had a reign of 23 years, and he showed himself to be an effective general under his father's administration that no one challenged him once he took control. So their faith in him was not misplaced, and he proved himself to be an even more effective emperor than his father. So Taizong is widely regarded as one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history, who had laid the foundation for the dynasty to flourish for centuries beyond the reign of his 23 years. Taizong is routinely cited for his many reforms and his policy of religious tolerance, which allowed diverse religions such as Christianity and Buddhism and established themselves in China alongside the indigenous practices of Confucianism and Taoism. Whatever his father had accomplished, Taizong improved upon and came to be regarded as a co-founder of Tang Dynasty and a model of just and efficient rule. Continuing and building upon the concepts of ancestor worship and the mandate of heaven, Taizong claimed divine will in his actions and intimated that those he had killed were now his counselors in the afterlife.
That's a nice thought. As with the previous rulers of China, the Tang faced regular attacks from the fierce nomadic tribes of the steppes. Around 623 CE, during the reign of the first Tang emperor, a new group of nomadic steppe warriors of Turkic origin, the Gokturks, had come to take the place of the old Shonyu we discussed. And the Shonyu, of course, had been driven far to the west. And by 624 CE, the Gokturks had become such a big problem that Emperor Gaozu seriously considered burning Chang'an, the capital, to the ground and moving the capital to Fancheng, a suggestion that the Crown Prince Li Tianchang and his other brother, who were both assassinated, supported. But of course, Li Shimen, who became Taizong, the Emperor Taizong, opposed this, and quite rightly so, because of what he was able to achieve. So Arif, just take us through this period in the relationship with the Gokturks.
So by 626, when Emperor Taizong had become the emperor, within 19 days of his coronation, he faced a crisis because the Eastern Turkish leader had launched a major incursion towards Changyuan. Emperor Taizong was forced to personally negotiate peace terms, including tributes to the Eastern Turks, before they withdrew. However, 2 years later, by 628, the Eastern Turks started to squabble amongst themselves, and in late 629 CE, they believed that the time was ripe for a major attack on the Eastern Turks. Emperor Chaoyong commissioned General Yi Yung with overall command of a multi-pronged army, attacking the Eastern Turks at multiple points. The army was successful in its attacks, and by late spring 630 CE, all the Eastern Turkish chieftains submitted to Tang rule. By 657 CE, the Tang armies succeeded in defeating the Western Khanate and bringing the whole of the Silk Route under their control. The Tang Emperor Chaoyong, who was from 626 to 649 CE, was now also seen as the Khan of the Gokturks and the Emperor of China. and Tang dynasty rule lasted from 630 to 682 CE.
So under Taizong's successor, Gaozong, who reigned between 649 to 683, the country experienced further reforms when Gaozong's wife Wu Zetian took control of the government. This name should be remembered as we will illustrate why she was so important. Unfortunately, Emperor Gaozong suffered stroke in 655 CE, and Wu began to make many of his court decisions for him, discussing affairs of state with his counselors who took orders from her while she sat behind a screen. So I said, Wu Zetian is China's only female ruler, and even though she is still seen as a very controversial figure today, her reforms laid the foundation for the later success of the great emperor Xuanzong, who reigned between 712 to 756 CE, and we'll deal with that later. So this lady ruled both as an empress on behalf of her husband, and then later on as sort of direct emperor. And the story of her rise is fascinating. Yusuf, just take us through this important lady ruler.
Yeah, so she, in 638 CE, Taizong chose a beautiful young 14-year-old named Wu Zhao as one of his concubines. And she was so lovely, she attracted the attention of his son, the Prince Li Zi, who was to become Emperor Gaozong. Wu began an affair with Prince Li Zi while she was still one of Taizong's concubines. When Taizong died in 649 CE, Wu submitted to the established custom and had her head shaved with the rest of Taizong's concubines. She was sent to a temple to live out the rest of her life as a nun, but Li Zi, who now became Emperor Gaozong, had her brought back to the court because he was in love with her. Wu became Gaozong's first concubine, and his love for her upset his wife, Lady Wang, and the former first concubine, Lady Zhao, to get rid of them and increase her power. Wu is said to have murdered her own infant daughter and framed Lady Wang for the crime. She quickly became the power behind the throne, and when Gaozong died in 683 CE, she declared herself Empress Wu Zetian, ruler of the heaven, taking control of Gaozong's sons.
So Wu Zetian's 50-year reign, one of the longest in Chinese history, was followed by another great emperor, Emperor Xuanzong, who reigned from 712 to 756 CE, the seventh emperor of the Tang dynasty. His reign of 44 years is again one of the longest of the Tang dynasty, and this period is seen by many as the golden age of the Tang dynasty, when China was the largest, most populous and most prosperous country in the world. Owing to the large population, armies of many thousands of men could be conscripted into service and military campaign against Turkish nomads and domestic rebels. And they had an amazing period. So Arif, just take us through some of the developments.
Yes, so under Shaoxing and Wu Zetian, Buddhism had been elevated as the most popular religion in the country. But Shaozong saw Buddhist teachings as lacking in spirituality, and so promoted Taoism, and even decreed that a copy of the Tao teaching be kept in every household. Zhaozong felt Taoism was a unifying belief which would promote greater harmony. And according to scholar Justin Wintle, his religious and political reforms resulted in domestic tranquility, which encouraged productivity and foreign trade. Shaoyong was a cultured man, a poet who patronized the arts and encouraged creative expression. Over 50,000 poems, plays, short stories and other literary works were produced during the Tang dynasty, mainly under Shaozong's reign, and an encyclopedia was completed. Woodblock printing, which began on a larger scale under Shaoyong, was improved, and more books became available, which led to greater literacy and better jobs for the lower classes, since they were now eligible to take civil service exams for government jobs. Public libraries were built to collect all the books in print, and calendars were able to be printed for wide distribution. Advances in medicine, such as recognizing symptoms of disease and how to treat it, were available now outside the medical profession through books, which also suggested preventative habits and promoted diet as contributing to a person's health.
So during the 44-year reign of Emperor Xuanzong, the empire stretched from the Pacific to the Aral Sea with at least 50 million people. There were vibrant artistic and cultural creations, including works of the two greatest Chinese poets, Li Bai and Du Fu. Again, there's so much that you could write books just on these two great figures. So Yusuf, just take us through the sort of important periods of his rule, Xuanzong's reign, why he succeeded and what led to his later failures.
Yeah, so he was successful because of his balanced approach in terms of promoting fairness and justice, and that improved the lives of many. And one of Wu Zetan's most important government reforms, which Zhuzang kept, was placing people in high positions based on their merit rather than sort of family connections. Teachers were hired because they knew their subject, not because they were another official's cousin. Agriculture administrators were promoted to their positions for the same reason, and so on with their appointments. This policy began to change when Zhuzong became tired of public life, and that was sort of approximately 734 CE, and began depending more on the advice of his consort lady, Lady Wu Hufei, who suggested he elevate a close friend of the family, Li Lunfu, to a more prominent position in order to take on some of the burdens of rule.
So we'll return to the lasting damage caused by this appointment of Lin Fu. But just to explain what was happening in the surrounding areas of China and the Tang state at that time, the Gok Turks took advantage of the disunity and intrigue going on in the Tang court, and they once again managed to win back their independent khanates and establish the second Turkic khanate in 682 CE, which lasted until 744, when it was overthrown by the Uyghur Khaganate. The Uyghur Khaganate had much closer political and cultural links with the Chinese dynasties and were considered the most sophisticated Turks by the Chinese. So, Arif, let's just get back to the appointment of this Lin Fu, because that, and again another important woman, basically destroyed the great achievements of the Tang dynasty. Just take us through that period.
Yes, so while the early period of Emperor Xiaoyang rule was known as a golden period of Tang rule, the appointment of Lin Lufu as chancellor proved to be a decision which would do more to destroy the Tang dynasty than any other. Lin Lufu was corrupt and a power-hungry man who only cared about advancing himself. While he played the part of the devoted servant of the emperor, he schemed to seize power himself and depose Xuanzong. In 737 CE, Consort Wu died and Xiaoyang withdrew further into his own pleasures, and he left the business of government to Lin Lufu. Xiaoyang had over 4,000 of the most beautiful women brought to the palace for his pleasure, and he kept them imprisoned there to entertain him. All of these women were nothing, however, once he saw the one who would be his true love and who would help hasten the decline of the Tang dynasty as much as any plan Lin Lufu could have devised.
It seems the great Tang rulers had a soft spot for beautiful women, doesn't it? It's so in 741 CE, Xuanzong fell in love with this lady called Yang Gufei, who was married to one of his sons, interestingly, and Yang left her a husband and moved into the imperial palace with the emperor. He neglected his duties as emperor and even further for this love affair, and had agreed to anything Lady Yang asked. So she began with a few requests to put her family members into these positions, etc., etc., and over time basically took over the appointments. So combined with Li Linfu and the transgression she was involved with, the Chinese dynasty, the Tang dynasty, started its internal destruction. Of course, this led to more control being given to generals and commanders in different parts of China. So central control weakened to such a state that major generals were aligned to different interest groups. And this really brings to the first big rebellion, the An Lushan rebellion, which virtually destroyed the Tang dynasty, because a half Sogdian, half Turk general named An Lushan saw the Yang family's abuses as a sign that Xuanzong was no longer fit to rule. And An Lushan commanded the best troops in the Chinese army and felt he had a duty to take action and lead these men to restore a proper government. So he mounted the rebellions against the ruling house in 755, leading an army of 180,000 against the capital to overthrow Xuanzong, the emperor. So Yusuf, just take us through this period, because the destruction had started with political and appointments, favoritism and cronyism. So this was really the downfall of the Tang dynasty. Gone.
Yeah, unfortunately it was, and seduction played a big part in terms of, as you mentioned before, the women. So between 755 and 763 CE, the country was torn apart by wars, and it believed that close to 36 million people had died. And Xunjiang fled the capital in 755 CE with Lady Yang. And a lot of those problems and troubles were, in terms of the military were accompanied by Lady Yang itself. And they, en route, had murdered her family. And Xunjiang realized he had allowed himself to be seduced away from his duties and allowed Lady Yang to be strangled. The story of the love affair of Xunjiang and Lady Yang was later romanticized by the Tang poet Beizhuji in 806 CE in his famous work, Song of the Everlasting Sorrow. It's a poem which remains popular in the present day. After Lady Yang's death, Xunjiang abdicated in favor of his son Li Heng, who became Emperor Suzong, and he reigned between 756 and 762 CE. Suzong battled the rebel forces but could not defeat them completely.
So some amazing achievements and some intrigues really that start destroying a great nation. And this brings me to another important clash for the Tang dynasty, because the Tang dynasty was one of the greatest Chinese dynasties, but they were about to clash with another major power. The Silk Road, of course, was important to the Chinese for a long time, especially during the Han dynasty. The Tang Empire remained a dominant force, shaping and controlling Central Asia and the Silk Road for many, many years. But towards the west, the Muslim Caliphate was establishing itself, with Islam, the new religion, being established in that part of the world, and the lands being the Sassanid lands and the Byzantium lands that were there being overtaken by the Muslims. So Arif, just take us how the Muslims and Chinese Tang dynasties interacted.
So yes, at its greatest height, the rise of the Tang dynasty also coincided with the rise of Islam. According to some Chinese Muslims' traditional accounts, Islam was first introduced to China in 616 to 618 AD by the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Other sources date the induction of Islam in China to 650 AD by Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, when he was sent as an official envoy to the Tang emperor during the reign of the Caliph Usman. Emperor Zhaoyong is said to have received the envoy and then ordered the construction of the memorial mosque in Canton, which is the first mosque in the country in memory of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. While modern secular historians tend to say that there is no evidence for Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas himself ever coming to China, they do believe that Muslim diplomats and merchants came to Tang China within a few decades from the beginning of the Muslim era. The early Tang dynasty had a cosmopolitan culture with intensive contacts with Central Asia and significant communities of originally non-Muslim Central and Western Asian merchants resident in Chinese cities, and this helped the introduction of Islam.
So during the 8th century, the Islamic world started expanding into Central Asia under the Umayyad Caliphate, thus becoming an important power along the all-important Silk Road. Inevitably, this was going to lead to a conflict between the Tang and the rising Umayyad Caliphate. Now, early on, between 715 and 750, a number of battles had taken place between the Umayyads and the Tang, but the Umayyads suffered devastating defeats. And instead of gaining new allies and territories, lost most of Transoxania. to the Tang. And as the powerful Tibetan Empire had allied with the Umayyads, the Tang took control of much of the Hindu Kush under the famous Tang commander Gao Xiazi. In 750 AD, Yusuf, again there were developments with the Umayyads. Take us through that.
Yeah, so we started seeing at that period the Umayyad Caliphate was replaced by the Abbasid Caliphate, which moved their capital from Damascus to Baghdad and had much deeper interest into the East and the Central Asia in particular. So by that time, the Abbasids came to power. The Tang had complete control over Central Asia. Around this time, the local states of Fergana and Tashkent, based around the borders of current Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, were feuding with each other. The state of Fergana asked for Chinese help, and Gao Jinji marched in spring of 750 AD, attacked and captured Tashkent. The princess had no choice but to flee and ask for Abbasids' help. The Abbasids gathered their troops and marched out under command of Ziyad Ibn Saleh, determined to restore Islamic power, long bereft to the steppes of Central Asia.
So in July 751 AD, the Tang and the Abbasid forces met in the valley of the Talis River to vie for control of the Seira Daria region of Central Asia. This battle is known as the Battle of Talis, one of the great battles of our time between the Tang and the Muslims, and various numbers are given for the two armies. But here the Muslims gave a crushing defeat to the Tang dynasty and really brought an end to their involvement on the Silk Road, which was overtaken now by the Muslims who governed. But however, the Muslims were quick to repair relationships with the Chinese. The Chinese, of course, the Tang were in no position to interfere in Central Asia, and the Abbasid had no desire to go any further. Gao's plan for a renewed battle never came to fruition for the Chinese. Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, in fact, who reigned between 754 and 755, sent over 4,000 Arab soldiers to help the Tang emperor put down the Andalusian rebellion we talked about. So relationships started improving. This is probably a good place to stop for the first part, and we will then carry on with the great achievements of the Tang dynasty and move on to the dynasties that came to replace. Please give us your feedback. Our hashtag at VI Living History. Be back with you soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. So welcome back to part 2 of this program. We were talking about the great Tang dynasty. At its height, it clashed with the rising Muslim powers, in particular the Abbasid Empire, and had a disastrous battle, the Battle of Talis, where the Muslims defeated the Tang armies. But after that, with the Muslims driving out the Chinese from Central Asia, the Abbasids, of course, now were free to spread their influence and the message of Islam across the whole of Central Asia, most notably the Turkic people of the steppes, who would one day be a major empire builders in the Muslim world. Thus, the relationship between the Chinese and the Muslim world started in a big way after that, but overall it was a friendly relationship. The emperors Taizong, Wu Zetian, and Xuanzong made the Tang dynasty the great era that it was. And although the dynasty remained in power, the golden age ended with Xuanzong's decline, which threw the country into chaos. The 7th and the first half of the 8th centuries were generally considered to be the era in which the Tang reached the zenith of their power. In this period, Tang control extended further west than any previous dynasty, stretching from North Vietnam in the south to a point north of Kashmir, bordering Persia in the west, to northern Korea in the northeast. So, Yusuf, your thoughts?
Yeah, so as with everything, the emperor started becoming more urbanized, increased in population, wealth, amassed wealth and so forth. And then at the start of the Tang dynasty, around 600 AD, 600,000 people lived in the capital, Shangan, and only Constantinople was as populous. About the year 700, Shangan became the biggest city in the world with 1 million people. Perhaps only Baghdad in the Middle East was anywhere near its size. After the Abbasids took over in 750 AD and made Baghdad their capital, in 800 AD, after the Lushan rebellion and several wars, 900,000 lived in Shangan, and it was still the biggest city in China. By the year 900 AD, Baghdad was far the biggest city in the world, but the population of Shangan was still about 750,000, and the new capital of the Tang Dynasty at Liyong had 1 million inhabitants.
So you can see how really China prospered and had some of the biggest cities of the time, but of course to be replaced by the Muslim empires, especially under the Abbasids, with Baghdad becoming the center of the world at one stage, really. And of course, Cordoba was quite a well-established city in Spain as well for the Umayyads in Muslim Spain. Many of the most impressive inventions and advancements in Chinese history, such as gunpowder, waterproofing, fireproofing, air conditioning, gas stoves, printing advancements in medicine, science, technology, architecture, and literature, came from the Tang Dynasty. So they were amazing, really, in many respects. Arif, just talk us through the importance of gunpowder
Yes.
and the Tang.
So obviously I think listeners will understand that gunpowder was a very important invention. It was invented in the 9th century China as one of the 4 great inventions, the other 3 being the compass, papermaking, and printing. Originally it was developed by the Taoists for medicinal purposes. Gunpowder was first used for warfare around 904 AD. Other technological advances led to the creation of clocks, and the first clock mechanism in the world was invented by the engineer Yi Jing in 725 CE. Mechanical expertise also resulted in the creation of automatons, motorized figures who move by themselves. They developed agricultural machines to speed up the process of planting, irrigating, and harvesting crops.
During the Tang Dynasty, China became the world leader in book production. In addition to the gradual spread of woodblock printing from the late Tang and Song, further boosted their lead ahead of the rest of the world. From the 4th century CE to about 1500, the biggest library collections in China were 3 to 4 times larger than the largest collection in Europe. Yusuf, just take us through this important bits in relation to printing and books.
Yeah, so, they boasted a large collection of books, and in terms of libraries, the imperial government book collections in Tang numbered about 5,000 to 6,000 titles in 721. The Song imperial collections at their height in the early 12th century may have even risen to 4,000 to 5,000 titles. These are indeed impressive numbers, but the imperial libraries were exceptional in China and their use was highly restricted. Only very few libraries in the Tang and Song held more than 1,000 or 2,000 titles, a size not even matched by the manuscript collections of the grandest of the great cathedral libraries in Europe. However, between the 9th to the early 12th centuries, libraries in Cairo, Baghdad, Cordoba held collections larger than even the ones in China and dwarfed those in Europe. From about 1500, the maturation of papermaking and printing in southern Europe also had an effect in closing the gap with the Chinese.
So as we noted earlier, the decline of the Tang Dynasty had started towards the end of the reign of Emperor Xuanzong, the last ruler of the Tang Dynasty with some ambition was Emperor Xianzong, who reigned from 805 to 820. He eliminated the eunuch control of his military and took personal control of the army. The emperors who followed Xianzong were ineffective, and the dynasty really ended in 907 CE. The period of the 5 dynasties and the 10 kingdoms followed from 907 to 960 CE, where the families and associates of the warlords who had claimed territories after the An-Lushan rebellion strengthened their control. China remained divided amongst these kingdoms until the rise of the Song dynasty, which we're going to come to now. So, Arif, perhaps you could explain the rise of the Song dynasty and a little bit about the period I've mentioned preceding
Yes.
that.
So the Song dynasty was around from 960 to 1279 AD. When the Tang Empire had collapsed in 906 AD, their territory was divided amongst kingdoms or tribes for 53 years. Then in the year 960, a general in a small kingdom rebelled against his own king. This general took the name Emperor Taozu, and he was emperor from 960 to 976 AD. And during the next 20 years, he and his son defeated the other kingdoms and so established the Song Empire, thus reunifying most of China. The Song dynasty went on to rule China for over 300 years, as I mentioned before, from 960 to 1279 CE, with the region split into two periods.
Again, that's quite a long period, isn't it, when you consider the Han was 300 years? And
Very long time.
But sorry, carry on.
No, I was just saying that there was two periods. There was a Northern Song period from 960 to 1125 and the Southern Song from 1125 to 1279. The Northern Song dynasty unified most of China, but not quite all of it. And the Khitan Lao dynasty, which lasted from 907 to 1125, ruled over Manchuria, Mongolia, and parts of northern China. Meanwhile, in the northwestern Chinese provinces, the Tangut tribes founded the Western Xia dynasty from 1032 to 1227.
The Chinese by this stage were, very civilized, inverted commas, and they really were compared to the rest of the world. They had concentrated more on developing their nation, but of course their northern neighbors were nomadic and warlike throughout. Aiming to recover the lost territory of Northern Song, they launched several military campaigns against the Liao dynasty in the early Song period, but they all ended in failures. And then in 1004, the Liao cavalry swept over the exposed North China plain and reached the outskirts of Kaifeng, forcing the Song submission. The Song reached an agreement which imposed heavy annual tributes from the Song treasury. However, the annual outflow of Song silver to the Liao was paid back through the purchase of Chinese goods and products, which expanded the Song economy and replenished its treasury. So whilst they were weak militarily, they could always really keep developing their economy through the products they had and the ingenuity and innovations they had. So Yusuf, if you could perhaps take us through this difficult period for China.
Yeah, certainly. Within the Liao Empire, the Zhoushan tribes, ancestors of the Manchu, were often rebelling.
Jurchen, I think they're known
Jurchen
as,
tribes, ancestors of the Manchu, were often rebelling against the Lao. To weaken the Lao, the Jurchen tribes formed an alliance with the Song dynasty and reduced the Lao dynasty to a vassal status in a 7-year war, which was between 1115 and 1122, establishing their own Jin dynasty. During this war, the Song forces fared badly against the Lao, but the Jin succeeded in driving the Lao to Central Asia. Through the campaign, the Jurchens discovered weaknesses about the Song military based in the north, as the Chinese for so long had been sending tribute to the Lao instead of actually fighting them. Song forces had failed to make a joint attack in a siege with the Jurchens, who viewed the Song generals as incompetent, banking on the possibility that the Song were weak enough to be destroyed. The Jurchens made a sudden and unprovoked attack against the Song in the north. Soon enough, even the capital of Kaifeng was under siege by Jin forces, and the Jurchen leader proclaimed himself the founder of a new era, the Jin dynasty, which is from 1115 to 1234.
So after a highly prosperous 165-year reign, the Northern Song dynasty came to an end, and the remnants of the Song court were forced to flee south from Kaifeng and establish a new capital in Hangzhou under the Southern Song dynasty. And that again all had a prosperous time. When Emperor Taizu took the throne of the Northern Song dynasty in 960 AD, he took a very important step which contributed to both China's economic success and also China's military weakness. He made sure no rival general ever became too powerful and gained the necessary support to take his throne. by introducing a system of rotation for army leaders. Further, he ensured that the civil service henceforth enjoyed a high status in the army by acting as their supervisory body. So this is what I said, because of all these steps, the military had become weakened, but of course economically, China was in a very strong position. Arif?
Yes, so Chaozu was unusual for his time, for the extent that he nurtured and promoted the educational system, scholarly rule, and scientific research in his empire. He expanded the imperial examination system so that most of his officials had to pass exams to prove their qualifications to rule. He staffed his government with well-educated people. He created academies that allowed a great deal of freedom of discussion and thought. These academies successfully nurtured world-leading scientists and officials who excelled in literature and arts, and their high level of education helped them formulate beneficial trade policies with other countries and introduce new weapons.
Emperor Taizu of Song was succeeded by his younger brother, Emperor Taizong, who reigned from 976 to 997 CE. The stability provided by the long reign of the first two emperors, at least compared to the chaotic previous centuries, gave the Song dynasty the start it needed to become one of the most successful in China's history. In 1125 CE, the Jin state attacked northern China, and Emperor Huzong, who reigned from 1100 to 1126 CE, was captured along with thousands of others. The emperor was released after payment of a massive ransom to the Jin, and in 1127 CE, the Song army made one of Haizong's surviving sons the emperor, who then took the title Gazong, and reigning from 1127 to 1162. After some half-hearted attempts and plans to take back the lost lands from the Jin state, these were abandoned, and a peace treaty was signed in 1141. Fortunately, the Song emperor still controlled the richest part of his former state, which included the wealthy merchant port cities and some 60% of the population. So the southern Song established their new capital at Hangzhou, as we mentioned before, and that was then a wealthy trading city. Under the 154-year reign of the southern Song, a new period of prosperity was going to start. So, Yusuf, if you could take us that period. They'd lost quite a bit of territory in the north, but they managed to carry on. Just take us through that period.
Yeah, so the prowess of military wasn't as, early on wasn't as strong as it could be, but Song dynasty in itself was considered one of the highest points of classical sort of Chinese civilization in terms of, their level of sophistication when it came to the economy, facilitated by advancements in technology that had not been seen in the world before. So the Song government itself was the first in the world to issue banknotes or true paper money nationally, the first Chinese government to establish a permanent standing navy, the first dynasty to use gunpowder in warfare extensively, and the first to use magnetic compass widely for navigation. So the Song era was one of two imperial eras, and incomparable, the other one was the Han, which we covered before, that had the most scientific and technical progress. Chinese scientists advanced the state of knowledge, astronomy, mechanical and engineering and other subjects. The Song dynasty was considered to be the golden age of great advancements in science and technology of China. Thanks to innovative scholar officials such as Su Song and Shen Ku. Shen Ku was the first to describe the magnetic needle compass's declination. Inventions such as the hydromechanical astronomical clock, the first continuous and endless power transmitting chain, woodblock printing and paper money were all invented during the Song dynasty. The porcelain was the best ceramic in the world.
I would put the Han, the Tang, and the Song really as some of the great dynasties. Of course, with the unification, that's a separate matter under Shi Hong Dai. Whilst China had developed wood block printing as early as 220 CE, during the Song era, this allowed information to be transmitted more reliably to a greater number of innovators. It is no coincidence then the Song dynasty was one of the most technologically advanced and industrially productive society in pre-modern era. You could spread your ideas and more innovators would come through, so it was a nice cycle. The Song Chinese mechanized textile production almost to a degree that would be seen in Britain centuries later. They invented the magnetic compass, as you mentioned, to open up great exploration of the seas and the wider world. They made advances in mathematics, geometry, cartography. All told, China from 1900 to 1300 CE made tremendous advances. The Song Empire enjoyed unprecedented economic growth. Arif, just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's some interesting examples. So the Song had a law that any farmer who planted on fallow land and paid taxes could own the land, and this encouraged peasants to become landowners. More land was cultivated than in the more populous Ming and Qing empires, and some farmers became wealthy. Major irrigation projects and canal building projects using advanced engineering techniques improved agriculture, transportation and trade. The Song introduced better strains of rice into China from Vietnam. They appointed farming experts to spread knowledge of new farming techniques, tools, fertilizers and irrigation methods. And they gave tax breaks to people who were beginning to farm unoccupied land and gave low-interest loans to them to buy new tools and crops. So you can see it was very sophisticated in what they were doing. As a result, farming became more and more efficient, and farmers aimed at producing more than they required for their own needs. Cities became more densely populated, markets thrived, and rural farmers began to grow crops they knew would demand high prices, such as sugar, oranges, cotton, silk, and tea. To transport all these goods by canals and sea to where they were in demand, thousands of ships had to be built, and so another industry became a success story. Companies became larger and more sophisticated with different levels of management and ownership. Guilds, wholesalers, partnerships and stock companies all developed as the Chinese economy began to slowly take on the appearance of something more akin to today's industrial model.
As a result of successful policies and a strong economy, the Song dynasty saw one of the biggest rises in China's population across the country. From the period of the Han Dynasty around 2 CE, historical fluctuations of growth and decline kept dynastic China's population between somewhere around 37 to 60 million over a period of at least the next 1,000 years from the Han period of 2 CE. By 800 CE, the population of China was around 50 million to 60 million. And during the Song period, which was between 960 to 1276 CE, and by 1100 CE, the population had grown to an estimated 110 to 120 million. So that's quite a growth. The Song dynasty, of course, thrived on maritime trade with neighboring states. Giant wooden vessels equipped with compasses traveled throughout the China Seas and northern Indian Oceans. The concept of insurance was developed through them, and with prosperous economic activities, the historically first use of paper currency also emerged in the western city of Chengdu as a supplement to the existing Song copper coins. De facto, of course, during the later Yuan dynasty, paper currencies become much wider. So Yusuf, just take us through the ships and maritime developments.
Yeah, so to protect that and support the multitude of ships sailing through and sailing for the maritime interests into the waters of East China Sea and the Yellow Sea to Korea and Japan, you then had the Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. It was necessary to establish an official standing navy. So the Song dynasty therefore established China's first permanent navy in 1132 with their headquarters at Dinghe. The Song dynasty was also a period of major innovation in the history of warfare. Gunpowder, while invented in the Tang dynasty, was first put into use in the battlefields by the Song army, inspiring a succession of new firearms and siege engines designs. During the southern Song dynasty, as its survival hinged decisively on the guarding the Yangtze and Hui River against the cavalry forces from the Jin in the north. With a permanent navy, the Song was prepared to face the naval forces of the Jing on the Yangtze River in 1161 in the Battle of Tangdao and the Battle of Kaishai. During these battles, the Song Navy employed swift paddle-wheel-driven naval vessels armed with traction trebuchet catapults aboard the decks that launched gunpowder bombs. Although the Jin forces boasted 70,000 men on 600 warships, and the Song forces only 3,000 men on 120 warships, the Song dynasty forces were victorious in both battles due to the destructive power of the bombs and the rapid assaults by the paddle-wheeled ships.
Just when the Song had become accustomed to their new state following the tremendous upheaval caused by the Jin, an even greater menace appeared, and once again it was from the north. And once again, what started off as an alliance turned out to be a total disaster for the Song dynasty. The nomadic Mongol tribes in the north had been assembled under the leadership of Genghis Khan. Again, we've covered that in detail in the two-part Mongol Empire series. And of course, the initial clashes were between the Mongols and the Jin dynasty. And the Song were sort of observing from far off. Despite the Jin dynasty being defeated by Genghis Khan, they still saw strangely the Song as their enemy rather than the Mongols. And this annoyed the Song, who made an alliance with the Mongols to defeat the Jin. But interestingly, just as the Jin were finally defeated by the Mongols, they turned on the Song, and we're going to come to the really development of the Yuan dynasty, which is the Mongol dynasty. But one of the reasons why the Mongols turned on the Song was that they took over the territories of the Jin, and the Mongols, of course, wanted those territories. And of course, there were a few clashes, and the Mongols, when they saw somebody trying to compete with them, did not take it lightly. So just as in the previous period when they had formed an alliance and lost the northern part of China, now they had formed an alliance with Mongols. And of course, they were not just to lose a part of China, they were going to lose the whole of China. So this brings us really on to the development of the Yuan dynasty. So who's going to take us through? Of course, I think we'll ask Arif, really, starting from what was the period of the Yuan dynasty? 1271?
1271 to 1368. This is when they ruled China, and it was the first foreign-led dynasty in ancient China. It was established by Kublai Khan, leader of the vast Mongol Empire, and thus for a short period the Yuan dynasty ruled over the largest Chinese empire. The Mongol conquest of South China began under Ogedei Khan and completed under Kublai Khan, and this was a final step for the Mongols to rule over the whole of East Asia under the Yuan dynasty, and it's considered the Mongol Empire's last great military achievement. As the Emperor of China, Kublai gave himself the reign name Shuzu, and in 1271 his new dynasty the name Yuan, meaning either origin, centre or main pivot. The start date of the Yuan dynasty is variously put at 1260 or 1271 or 1276. These are all essentially milestones within the empire. And to rule his empire, Kublai Khan utilized the government structure he found established in the Jin and Song empires, but he replaced the officials with foreigners. In 1266, Kublai made Dodu, modern-day Beijing, his capital, and this further alienated him from his Mongol kinsmen, who claimed he didn't follow Mongol ways and wasn't loyal to the Mongols.
I think this probably, because we've covered the Mongol Empire and the period of Kublai Khan in detail in the Mongol Empire, we'll probably stop here. But to say that the Mongols basically demoted the Han Chinese and brought in people from the Muslim world in a big way, and all the other areas they conquered. And in a way, they sent the Chinese to the Central Asian and Muslim lands to divide and rule and really control over. They introduced paper currency and many other achievements as well, which can be covered. So because we've covered the Mongol Empire and the Yuan dynasty before, we'll bring this to an end. So as concluding remarks, we covered today the Tang dynasty, which was one of the great dynasties that ruled for 300 years and had some of the great emperors of China. And of course, there was a chaotic period as well following their decline, but the Song dynasty really restored some of the greatness of China. But militarily, they were no match for some of the northern invaders. And of course, the Jin and the Yuan were the sort of foreign incursions, and the Yuan dynasty was the first foreign-led dynasty of China, had many great achievements behind it, and perhaps we could cover a little bit in part 3 next time as well. But again, the Yuan became a very cosmopolitan dynasty, and at one stage actually it was the Khanate as well. So China, you could say, had the greatest empire going from the Chinese sea coasts all the way to Europe as well. But that only lasted for a short while. But the Yuan dynasty lasted a significant period within China. So I hope you've enjoyed this part as well. Inshallah, we'll be back with part 3 next time. So until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.